Thanks a lot, John, for moderating this session and for my introduction. So this is supposed to be the last session from track 3. I hope so, but hopefully not the least. Hope all are still awake. It's 5:30 here. I'm from Austin, Texas. Anyhow, I'm really excited to speak about how we can improve the application security while we build any kind of a DevSecOps pipeline. Right? A little brief intro about me. I know John did provide an overview of me. So I'm based out of Austin, Texas. For folks, those who do not know about me, I work for Cognizant Digital Business Consulting. I started my career in development, then I moved to consulting with overall 23 years of IT experience. I've been part of multiple continuous delivery transformation, and I have performed 100+ assessments for various clients across the globe and enabled them to succeed through their transformation journeys. As John mentioned, I'm really privileged to be the first TMI lead assessor in the entire North and South American continent. We also had Eric today morning, who was one of the keynote speaker. He's my inspiration, and I think most of you know, he's the CEO of TMI Foundation. And we had a great collaboration, and he's a great business partner as well. So overall, I have completed 21 years of, 21 certifications so far in multiple diversified areas. And this is my 15th conference speaking session. And I've been a speaker in many leading conferences like DevOps Days, DevSecOps Days, ASTQB, ASQ, Docker Conference, Computer Security Conference. And I'm really excited to be speaking here in PNSQC conference. In fact, I'm not new to PNSQC. I still see a lot of familiar names here, Prashant, Bhushan. We have like Phil is there. So I've interacted with quite a few people here. This is my 5th time speaking in PNSQC. I'm happy to be here in your midst. Okay. So let's get started into our paper presentation. Right? All right, let me start with a question. What is DevSecOps? Right? So if I have to ask you over the chat, I'm sure all the people here, you will be the 15 folks who are here. I will have 15 separate definitions. I'll have 15 different definitions. I would rather put it like that, right? So the very word tells us that there are 3 different groups involved: Dev, Sec, the development team, security, and operations. Okay? So there are multiple ways where one can define DevSecOps. So it is basically a way of approaching your IT security with an everyone is responsible for security mindset. Right? So what typically happens is you start injecting your security practices into your DevOps pipeline, which is already existing. Right? So the goal is to incorporate security into all stages of your software development workflow. But at the same time, you have to make sure that you're not going to add more bureaucracy, you're not going to add more kind of gatekeeping into your existing pipeline. Right? So that is our key goal here. So security shouldn't be a burden. So that is the overall objective of DevSecOps. And if your client is already doing DevOps, I think it's a very good idea to consider shifting towards DevSecOps. Okay. Let me go to the next slide. Why DevSecOps? Right? So if you see here, I've just put together a graph. It is, in fact, it's a picture of a recent survey, which is conducted by a company called Synopsys. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar about Synopsys. Those who are into the security line, they know that Synopsys was one of the leader in Gartner's Magic Quadrant for application security testing. Right? So let's have a look at the results. If you have a deeper look at the results, right, you will come to a conclusion that there is very limited focus which has been given to DevSecOps tool adoption. So that clearly says the need is huge to increase investment in various tool set to have a very secure product. Right? If I were to ask you what kind of phones you use, I think most of you would say either Apple or Android phone. Right? I use Apple phone. I was using Android phones earlier. So more than 85% of the applications from your stores, app stores, right, public app stores. Like in my case, I have Apple phone, so it's Apple Store. And those who have Android, you will be having Google Play, right? So 85%, in fact, more than 85% of your applications from these app stores they violate one or more, in fact, even more of the top 10 risks or vulnerabilities that have been identified by OWASP. Right? So that shows even our mobile phones are prone to attacks. And hence the importance of DevSecOps is even more prominent today. All right. So there are, if you see here, the continuous delivery pipeline, there are 4 aspects to it. Right? Again, if you're familiar about the SAFe methodology, we have the latest version, which is SAFe 5.0. So you can see that the SAFe continuous delivery pipeline has 4 aspects, which is continuous exploration, continuous integration, continuous deployment, and release on demand. Right? So we want to see how security is embedded into all these 4 different pillars. So before that, right, I'll just give a quick overview of those 4 different pillars. I think that will be more easier for me to get on to the next slide. Let's talk about what is exploration, integration, deployment, and release on demand. So continuous, I won't go into detail, but at a very high level, if you see continuous exploration, which is a CE, it is the very first pillar here in the continuous delivery pipeline. So they focus on creating alignment on what needs to be built. Right? That's going to be the first key aspect. Right? So once you have your continuous exploration, then you have your continuous integration, which focuses on taking your features from the program backlog, and then you start implementing them. Right? So basically, the development happens here in CI, the continuous integration. Right? So the next comes the continuous deployment. Right? So what happens is you take the changes that has happened in the staging environment, and then you deploy them to the production, the prod environment. Right? And then they are available, they are ready for release, but you're not releasing it now. Right? So this phase is continuous deployment. So in release on demand, what happens is you're going to make available to the customers either all at once, or you're going to do it in a staggered fashion based on your business needs, or it could be based on the market demands and market needs. Right? So that is what is release on demand. So now let's see what happens, how security is going to be embedded, how we are going to have a DevSecOps practices inbuilt into these 4 different key pillars in continuous delivery pipeline. So let's start with the first one, which is continuous exploration. Right? So off late, you can see a lot of organizations, they always, if you take most of the key top technology providers, they talk about digital, right? And all the tech vendors, the key technology providers, they talk about cloud. Most of them, they talk about cloud. They have applications which are cloud-based. So there's more digital, there's more cloud-based nowadays. Right? So with these improved digital transformation, improved cloud transformation, the IT systems, they face a lot of risks. They face increased vulnerabilities. Okay? So that is the reason we have threat modeling, which is a very key practice in continuous exploration. What basically threat modeling does is, okay, before that, I mean, this is applied very, very much early into the life cycle. Right? And the basic, the reason that we are involving threat modeling is to identify any kind of a threat, because you're exploring your product, right? You're exploring your backlog items. So you're going to identify threats, you're going to mitigate them with a structured model. And this helps you to identify your security requirements. It will pinpoint your security threats and potential vulnerabilities. And then once you identify your threats, you'll be able to quantify your threat and vulnerability criticality. Right? So once you quantify your threat criticalities, you'll be able to prioritize them, and you'll be able to mitigate them with some remediation steps. Right? So that's the gist of what threat modeling is all about. Right? And I've seen a lot of companies, especially the consulting companies, business consulting companies, they have started using threat modeling as a service. Right? So it's one of the key offering in many of the leading security providers, many of the leading security consulting companies. Let me put it that way. Right? And this has 4 key steps, and these 4 are very critical in threat modeling as a service. Right? So number 1 is going to be, what are we going to build? Right? So in this particular aspect, right, you basically study your data flow transitions, you study your architecture diagrams, right, and then your data classifications. So once you start building all those, once you start analyzing and studying all those elements, you kind of get a virtual model of the network that you're going to protect. Right? So now we know what we're going to build. Right? And after this, we are going to start identifying the threats. What could go wrong in my virtual model of the network? So basically what you do is you start using your threat modeling methods, the techniques, to further classify the threat types, right? So you'll be able to identify any kind of a potential threats. Right? You will be able to map your data flows, and then you'll be able to quantify your risk here. Right? So now you know you have identified your threats here. That's going to be your step 2. Right? So once you have identified your threat, right, the potential vulnerability threat, so now the immediate action is how are we going to mitigate, right? So what are we going to do to defend against all these threats? So that's going to be the step 3. So you basically review the layers of your applications. There are multiple layers that will be involved. So you review them to identify your security controls, right, related to the threats. And here you have your vulnerability categories that will help you to focus on the areas where mistakes are most often made, right? So that helps you to focus on mitigating and taking the right action, action item to remediate your the threats that you have. Okay? The last step is validate, right? Have you acted on all the previous steps that we saw earlier? So basically, again, you start doing from step 1 to step 3 is basically you start doing all over, right? Building, identifying the threats and mitigating. So that's all. That's part of your step 4, which is validate.
Suresh?
So these are the key elements. Sorry.
Yeah, Suresh, we had a question come in that might be answered now, or you can take it later, but they were wondering if you would suggest or have a favorite threat modeling technique.
So let me put the chat window.
Let me copy it over here for you. Sorry, it didn't.
Yeah.
I just realized it didn't go to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
Okay, so the different threat modeling techniques. So basically, I mean, these are the 4 key steps that we typically follow, right? But again, there are multiple techniques which I practically haven't applied, but most of the companies, I mean, who follow DevSecOps religiously, I think they, and again, not everyone follows threat modeling as a service. Some directly focus on your continuous security into your continuous integration. But I think I think I need to I can respond over an email, or probably you can
Sure.
I can take a stab at it later. But I'm not aware of the different techniques applied here. But those are the basic key steps which is going to be consistent in any kind of a technique or method when it comes to threat modeling. Okay. All right, let's move on to the continuous integration. Okay. All right. So as I told you earlier, continuous integration, the actual developments happens here, right? So when I say actual development, this is where the code is going to be built, right? So security is it has to be built into this continuous integration pillar, because you start writing your code here, and code is more prone for more vulnerabilities. If you have to tackle it right in the early phase, shift left, I think this is the area that we need to focus more, right? So let's go through the different practices one by one. I know this is going to be a very key element in our whole presentation, so I'll take a little bit of more time if you don't mind, but I'll try to finish it on time, right? So I'll start with if you see here, the security ID plugins. So what those plugins do is they basically give the developers direct feedback with analysis, right? When you start writing your code, so the developers, they write the code. So before the code is checked in, right? So they will have these plugins will tell them what are the potential gaps, what are the potential areas that the developers have to focus on. Right? So you get a direct evident. It's very evident. I mean, even before it is checked in. So these plugins help the developers to identify, focus on certain areas where code can become a potential threat. right? And there are multiple tools available in the market. Some of the good plugins are Eclipse, which is very, very popular. You also have IntelliJ. Those are the two popular plugins available in the market. Right? So the next comes your code review. Right? So code reviews, in fact, they are great means to make sure you have certain code qualities in place, right? And based on the patterns that come from multiple code reviews, right? So what happens is you can automate rules using your code analyzer. And you have your pair work, which is again based on the extreme programming concepts. They provide real-time feedback directly during your design or during your coding, right? Where you temporarily pair the team with a security expert. Right? The next element is going to be the SAST, which is the static application security testing, or some call it white box testing, right? Where there are multiple SAST tools available in the market. So what they basically do is they will scan the source code of your application and potentially, and they will be able to identify any kind of a threat, security vulnerabilities in your code, in your architecture. Okay? In fact, if you see, based on the industry numbers, the SaaS tools, they detect almost 50% of your existing security vulnerabilities. So that's the reason this SAST is very, very critical element of your DevSecOps pipeline, because 50% of your threats are gone, right? Once you have proper, effective SAST scanning tools in place. And I'm sure there could be more questions. What are the common tools, SAST tools, right? CAST is one tool that we have seen. SonarQube is very, very widely used. So those are the two key tools, and you have many more tools available in the market. So then you have your security, the third-party scans, right? So I'm sure of late, I mean, you have your third-party libraries, you have your third-party components, right? So those third-party code should also be scanned by the static code analysis. Then we have your fuzz testing. So what you basically do is you randomly feed some invalid inputs, some unexpected inputs, right? Some unexpected data you just feed into it. And then you start finding coding errors. You start finding the loopholes, the security loopholes in your code. So that's what basically happens in fuzz testing. And now your code, once it is ready to be shipped, it can be code signed. So what you typically do is you put a digital signature on your code, on your program or a file, right? So its authenticity and the integrity can be verified once you install or once you start executing your code. So that's what basically is code signing, right? And infrastructure scans, they will be able to assess the security levels of your infrastructure. It includes your malware in servers. It could be your application server. It could be your databases. It could be your open ports. It could be any kind of an outdated components like your old SSL or SMTP or DNS versions. And again, infrastructure as code practices are adopted, and IAC scans are done to secure your IT infrastructure. So then you do your malware scans for your SaaS infrastructure before you package any kind of a component. So finally, last but not the least, the dynamic scans or the dynamic application security testing, DAST, which is also known as black box testing. So that is being performed where you do not have access to the code like SAST. In SAST, basically you input your code, but here it is you execute your code. You don't have access to the code here. Right? And whatever the potential vulnerabilities that was not detected by SAST, DAST is a very effective element to make sure you identify those threats. Right. So let's get on to the continuous deployment practices. Okay. So if you see here, the key practice is pen testing. Right? They call it penetration testing. They're also called ethical hacking. Right? So we saw earlier SAST and DAST. Right? So unlike those SAST which you saw and DAST we saw, pen testing does not necessarily focus on your code elements alone. Right? So it also focuses on other areas. It could be your hardware, it could be your operating system, also includes your software, obviously, and it could be any kind of a vulnerability that comes from any human components as well. So it includes everything. It covers all components of a system, right? And we sell a lot of scan tools for your DAS and your SAS, right? So potentially the pen testing is done by it's not automated, but it's usually done by a professional, security professional. I would rather put it like this, right? But of late, there are a lot of automated ways of doing, automated mechanisms have been put in place to make sure pen testing is more effective. So last element here, which we're going to discuss, is the release on demand. Okay. So if you see here, the continuous security monitoring practice, it's a very key practice in this particular aspect, the last pillar, which is the release on demand. Right? So here, what you basically do is you monitor your system using automation to find some security breaches. Right? So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar. So this is usually done, the security, continuous security monitoring, it's done by security information and event management system. Right? So I'm sure there will be incidents. Once you have your security incidents, those are logged. And there is a security response team, which is also called CSIRT, right? Which is computer security incident response team. So what this security response team does is they gather all information related to the newly discovered vulnerabilities. Okay? So they feed this information back to the development team and the operations team. And you can see the other sub practices, right? So what typically happens is you have your application providers, they will be issuing the bulletins, security bulletins, to make sure to inform your customers, right, about this newly discovered vulnerabilities and what are the key action that they're going to take, right? And what are the mitigation steps involved in making sure that this doesn't happen in future, right? So those are basically the sub practices within this element in the overall release on demand pillar. Right? So let's get into the next slide, which is a key element. So there's a lot, if you see, Gartner has put together multiple best practices, and I've gathered few more from other leading providers as well. Right? So what you see here is, again, it's just a few best practice that will make sure your DevSecOps process runs smoothly. The very first element is automation, right? Everything has to be automated. Without automation, there is no way of doing a DevSecOps implementation. Right? And automation, it has to start with your shift left practices. Right? Again, everything has to shift left for better effectiveness, for better efficiencies. Right? So DevSecOps starts much early in the game. That's why we discussed about continuous exploration, that it starts much early in the phase. You start using a threat modeling. Again, not many companies uses it, but still, that's a good practice. You start doing shift left, and especially threat modeling is going to help you out. Right? Third element is going to be your security champions. You're going to create security champions, right? So what I mean is security champions is you're making sure that whoever is part of your release train or your existing team, you're going to train them. You're going to make them a champion, right? Instead of bringing some security professional, right, security experts, you can make your existing team itself to be a security champion. Right? That's one of the key best practice from Gartner. Right? So how can they be a champion? Obviously, comes the next practice. People will have to be trained. Your developers will have to be trained on the security practices. Right? But when you train them, always keep in mind, don't expect them to be a security expert. And their primary focus is going to be coding. So again, don't burden them to make a coder become a security expert, right? But again, it's good to create security champions, but there are a lot of companies where they have dedicated security professionals as well. Again, it depends on the budget and other constraints. Right? The next is going to be carrying out threat modeling. Right? So we already saw that as part of a continuous exploration, which happens much before, even before you start doing your build. Right? Okay. So the next is going to be your strong version control implementation. Right? Obviously, I mean, this is a very, very key practice to have effective version controlling mechanism on all your code, components. Last but not the least, we have to focus first on identifying and removing any known open source vulnerabilities. Right? There are a lot of tools available here in this particular space, but I've just given a logo of white source, right? Because they are number one leader in this particular space. Right? So any known open source vulnerabilities, you have a lot of key practices from white source who are well effective in making sure those open source vulnerabilities are effectively addressed. So those are some of the key practices which I just want to highlight. And let's see how can we make sure whatever the practices that we saw earlier, right, they are effective or not. Right? How can I ensure that the DevSecOps practices are working smoothly, right, by having these measures in place? Right? And these, I mean, I have 6 measures here. If you take any chief information security officer, they will have, it's a must metrics for them. I'd rather put it like that. Right? So to make sure your DevSecOps implementation is working strongly, right? So these metrics are going to be going to play a key role to make sure that the practices are adhered to or not. Okay? So let's go through these metrics very quickly. Right? I'll go through them. The first is reduced total security tickets open. So we talked about the security tickets. There will be an incident team, response team, right? So you start counting your security related tickets that are open, right? So if those tickets are coming down, then it shows your DevSecOps practices, your DevSecOps tool implementation are working effectively, right? So that's why this is a very key metrics to begin with, right? The tickets are coming down drastically. That's a good sign that your practices are well adhered to, right? The next is reduce time to deploy. Okay? So we talked about threat modeling. We talked about a lot of different security shift left practices, right? So with all these different elements, you'll be able to not only identify the security threats, right? You'll be able to fix them much early. You'll be able to fix them easily, right? So what happens as a result? Your time to deploy gradually comes down, right? So that's why reduced time to deploy is, again, another key measure for your DevSecOps practice. Right? Then discovery of your pre-production vulnerabilities. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar about defect removal efficiency. Right? They call it DR or defect phase containment. You can also have it based on different phases of your software development lifecycle. So this is very much similar to your defect removal efficiency, right? Where you are trying to contain maximum vulnerabilities in the pre-production environment, right? So you're going to make sure that the security related defects are not getting leaked onto the production, right? If it gets leaked onto the production, then it's going to be a very costly rework, right? So that's why this is a very key metrics to make sure that all the defects are contained in the pre-prod, and you try to fix it so that it's going to be a defect-free product that you're going to release it to the customer. Okay. The next is reduce time to remediate. Okay. So we saw about strong collaboration. We saw about shared responsibilities of the DevSecOps team, right? So with all these strong collaborations, shared responsibility mindset, so you should be in a position to remediate security-related defects faster with, again, less time. Right? So that's why time to remediate has to gradually come down. Right? So if it's going up, then probably there's something wrong with your DevSecOps adoption. Right? Then we have a lot of audits, security audits that happens in most of the organizations. Right? If you talk to the chief information security officer, so their ultimate goal is to make sure every security audit, right, it is 100% pass. Right? If it is not passed, then it reflects very badly on the entire team, right? Not just on the chief information security officer alone. Obviously, he's accountable, right? At the org level, yes, he is accountable, but every team member is responsible. Right? So that's why I told you in the beginning when I started telling you about the definition of DevSecOps. Right? It is everyone's responsibility. Okay? So this metric should ideally improve if it is not 100%, has to be 100%, gradually improve towards 100%. Right? So that means 100% of your audits are getting passed. Last is reducing your failed security test. So when a release gets rejected, it could be because of security failure. So it impacts every other metrics that we saw earlier. Okay? So it comes with serious consequences. You miss the time to deliver. So then what happens is the development will have to again rewrite the code. Right? The team will have to again identify and fix any potential vulnerabilities. So hence this reduction in security failed build, it's an important metrics to deliver better product and also at the same time a safe product. So those are the 6 key metrics to help measure your effectiveness. In terms of
Suresh, we have about 5 minutes left. Just a quick time check for you.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, let me see if there are any. Okay, yeah, I didn't notice the time. Okay, all right.
It's not a hard stop, but if you can, just want to give you the timing.
Yes. All right, so these are some of the key benefits, right? Faster delivery. Obviously, speed is going to be improved when security is integrated into your overall pipeline, right? And then you have your security posture getting improved with all your collaboration, with all the shared security mindset. Right? And since your defects, your vulnerabilities are getting identified much early in the phase, right? With all the phase containments, you're able to detect, you're able to reduce the rework. You can see an exponential reduction in your cost, in your risk, operational cost coming down, in your overall rework cost coming down. So reduced cost is going to be an important element. And you can see the value of DevOps getting enhanced here with all the different shared responsibility mindset and security posture. Right? As security is tightly integrated, you can see more agility here. You can see the improvement in the pace at which the applications are getting delivered. Right? So that's a key element. The last but not the least, with greater trust in the security of your developed product, you can see you're able to not only meet, you're able to exceed your business objectives. The customer is going to be happy overall. Right? So that's what we all want. So that's a key element. So these are some of the benefits which I just want to quickly run it. Let me summarize my overall presentation. I know we have like a couple of minutes left. So what we saw is we saw what is DevSecOps. We saw why it is needed, and what are the different aspects of your continuous delivery pipeline, and how security can be injected into those key pillars as part of your pipeline, right? And how can we measure the key, the implementation of your DevSecOps pipeline using those 6 key metrics, and what are the key benefits that any organization can derive from from having the DevSecOps practices getting implemented. Right? So those are the key summary that we saw, and I'm sure there may be more questions, more follow-up questions. If I'm not able to answer, if you don't have time, then probably you can either contact me to my email. I'm just hope you can see my screen. I have my email here. If you want, I can even put this into the chat.
The screen is clear there. There were a couple of questions in the chat. So there's one that asks, are there any key measures that can potentially come from static scans?
Key measures. Okay, all right. So if you see the key measures, right? We talked about 6 metrics, which is more pertaining to the DevSecOps implementation. But in terms of your SAST, the key measures are going to be the code quality. I would say that is going to be my #1 key metrics, which focuses on multiple parameters, right? It is related to your bugs. It is related to your anti-patterns. It is related to your refactoring of your code, right? It also factors any kind of a poor coding practices or potential vulnerabilities, right? So code quality factors all those different elements. And I talked about different tools like CAST and SonarQube, right? You can automatically get the code quality from these tools. And they have other measures. The code quality also has measures inbuilt, like which focuses on product quality, which is related to reliability, releasability, security vulnerabilities, security reviews, and in fact, code smell, which is related to the maintainability of your issues, any kind of issues within the code, right? So overall, code quality is the number one key measure for your static application testing.
And there was one about which version controls are used mostly.
Version controls, I think Microsoft has some good key tools available. I guess even YVeeam has some tools. I don't remember on top of my mind, but I can let you know on that. John.
Yeah, and there was just one more that that I personally had. So I worked with some of the people that founded a company called Shift Left, and they actually try and look in the code itself to help you identify practices. Are those tools that you recommend or have experience with, like Shift Left?
So tools like, I didn't get your question. So Shift Left tools, can you give an example?
So Shift Left is a company, and their tools look at identifying vulnerabilities. And you mentioned open source, but I think this is just in general, to understand what coding errors could be and that are not easy for people to identify. Security coding areas.
Okay. Yeah, there are a lot of tools, lot of vendors on different areas, right? You take any like SAST or DAST or any area, even the security information and event management. Lot of providers. You have your IBM, you have Microsoft, you have Splunk is also there. So, but again, Shift Left as a vendor, I'm not sure, but there are a lot of such providers available in the market. Okay. And okay, I'm sure it involves a lot of investment, but at the same time, I'm sure this could be one of the questions, right? Should I have to invest on multiple different tools, SAS tool, DAST tool, Shift Left practices, so many other tools. But again, there are providers like Veracode, right? So they are leading providers in terms of having a robust end-to-end app governance. So what they do is they have both Veracode static analysis as well as Veracode dynamic analysis. So all end-to-end solution using one provider.
Great. Well, I think we're about ready to wrap up. There's a survey that we'd like people to fill out for this session and also for the conference. So I think that's important to get. I'll just drop in here before we go the company I happened to mention here, Shift Left, was an interesting one. You had the name and things. So lots of innovation that continues to go on. So, we certainly appreciate your talk and helping us go from DevOps to DevSecOps. That's a big innovation and theme that's going on there. So we can benefit from people who are pioneering that work. And again, thank you for the paper and your presentation, Suresh.
Thank you, John. Thank you all.